Hi, this is Brian Bieron with PlatformEconomyInsights.com, and today's topic is to take a look at the policy implications of the proposed Google acquisition of FitBit. Now, why is this important? And actually, I think from the perspective of looking at digital platform policy, this is super interesting. And it's very interesting because of the fact that Google is obviously one of the biggest digital platforms in the world. It's one of the GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. It's a giant. And the world's policymakers are obviously spending meaningful time thinking about how they can deal with the challenges from the giant platform businesses. And one of the topics that shows up just about everywhere when government policymakers are looking at policies to deal with the digital giants is changes to acquisition and merger law. In other words, there's concern on a bunch of different levels about what acquisitions and mergers mean for these giant digital businesses. So let's encapsulate really quickly what's being proposed. So Google has been reported to have offered $2.1 billion to buy FitBit, who is the largest company focusing on digital wearable devices. So Fitbit devices being various kinds of smartwatch type wearables that track data from the users on steps and heart rate and various kinds of activities. They've also built apps around that where the company will track health-related things for the wearer. And in fact, they are reported to have been in discussions with various companies, including insurance companies and others, about how what Fitbit devices and services can do from a health perspective could be part of broader healthcare offerings. So you bring together data, technology, health in a way that's really interesting. And Google has proposed to buy them. And it's been reported that one of the major reasons is apparently Google's effort to challenge Apple, who is one of the biggest companies in the wearable space, in particular with their Apple Watch and all the different kind of related services that they can or could combine with their watch. So it's the idea that it's a way for Google to take on Apple. So I said, why is this interesting from a policy perspective? Well, governments around the world are looking at acquisition limits as part of policies to deal with the supergiant digital companies. And the kinds of topics that are being discussed in the context of acquisition limits include things like the importance or the increased importance of data when it comes to how companies operate. So you have the idea that the biggest digital companies have the most data, and giving them access to even more data sources is even more problematic than it would be for other kinds of businesses. So you have this idea that data needs to be treated differently than it has in the past. Now, some would argue that data has always been a part of acquisition and merger competition law reviews, but some believe that it needs to be an even bigger part when it comes to these digital giants. So you have data. You've also got the idea that the big digital companies use acquisitions in the context of what are called killer acquisitions. The idea that a digital company, a big giant, identifies a small up-and-coming company and acquires them as a way to keep them from emerging as a future competitor. Now, in the context of Google and Fitbit, I don't think that's an issue. But then the third really big theme is that maybe the digital giants are just so big that they should be limited in their ability to get any bigger. Not necessarily for a specific reason, but that some believe that actually big at a certain point is bad. And so limiting acquisitions is a way to, in a very direct way, keep them from artificially getting even bigger. Now, that doesn't hold a lot of weight with a lot of antitrust experts. But the reality is, from a political perspective, that might end up being one of the most important considerations. Because at the end of the day, you can't argue that the big giant digital platforms are in fact really big, and where, let's say, unwinding past acquisitions or breaking up a company is really difficult from a legal and political perspective to do, stopping a future acquisition is much easier. So big is bad is clearly on the table as a reason. But then, in the context of Google and Fitbit, the reasons that are often raised as to why acquisition limits are actually a problem really come to the fore with this particular acquisition. And I'd like to go through a couple of them. One of them is the idea that the kind of competition that really benefits consumers and the economy overall, that competition in many cases, in fact, is going to be big company versus big company. That while some might think that real competition emerges from the bottom up with new upstarts, that there's nothing wrong, some argue, with big versus big. And that's one of the things that's clearly at play in this particular acquisition. As I said, many people believe that Google is buying Fitbit in order to better challenge Apple in the wearables and related services market. So you have Apple as the biggest company in that space when it comes to the size of the company. Google is apparently trying to buy Fitbit in part to challenge Apple. And if it takes a giant to challenge a giant in many cases, well, then this acquisition would be pro-competitive in that context. At least some will make that case. Another argument that those who believe that acquisitions are actually pro-competitive, even by the biggest companies, they argue that it's a very important monetization avenue for an entrepreneur. So Fitbit has been lauded for being a very effective entrepreneurial company in the wearable space. They were one of the first, and they've been certainly the most successful, where many startups and small companies emerged. The one that's really been there from the beginning and is still there and is a major player, as I said, Fitbit is the largest player in the wearables market, was Fitbit. And at the end of the day, they're worth, according to Google, $2 billion or so. Obviously, giants like Google and Apple and Amazon, these are approaching trillion-dollar businesses. The ability of the entrepreneurs who built Fitbit to eventually cash out, get compensated for their successes, potentially to go on and do other great things. But whatever, the innovators and those who invested in Fitbit as an innovative, smaller company, the ability to have that company get acquired for a couple of $2 billion is, many would argue, really important to promote and spur future innovators and entrepreneurs. So here's a case of the small company faced with meaningful challenges from big companies, seeing an acquisition as a way to get rewarded for their hard work. Now, another topic that's worth noting in the context of this acquisition is the fact that, along with Apple and Samsung being major competitors to Fitbit in the wearables market, that there are actually two Chinese firms. Huawei, those of you who follow digital public policy would know that there are a number of issues related to Huawei and telecom hardware in particular that has Western governments, especially the United States government, concerned from a security perspective. Well, Huawei is a player apparently in wearables, as is a company called Xiaomi, and if I mispronounced, I apologize. But one of the other topics that I think is worth noting is that having Google acquire Fitbit does have another major U.S. player who will be theoretically in this space of not just the wearables themselves, but the related data connected services, especially in the healthcare space. And obviously, there are going to be government and political sensibilities about the kinds of companies that have access to that data. So where there have been, right off the bat, a lot of concerns raised about the fact that Google would have access to this new kind of data on people, namely physical fitness and health data, which they have some now. There are Google-related and Google-connected smartwatches, none of them nearly as popular as the FitBits. So Google has some connection right now to data that's in the physical fitness and health space, but they're obviously aiming to get more. For all the criticisms that Google is likely to face regarding their access to data and what their policies are for things like privacy and all the rest, trust me, it's nothing like a big Chinese firm would have. We're seeing so many issues raised regarding Chinese digital company access to American user data that's going to play a part, I think, in this policy review as well. So, to sum up, the Google acquisition of FitBit, which may or may not go through, and I would add one note, that it's reported that Google's agreement with FitBit to purchase the company includes a $250 million payment that Google will make to FitBit if, in fact, the acquisition is spiked by retailers and it does not go through. So that's a little bit of an insurance policy for Fitbit. If they spend the next year trying to get this acquisition through and it doesn't happen, they do get a payment from Google. But that acquisition is going to be reviewed by multiple governments. And as I said, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, the European Union, Korea, Japan, Australia, all of these competition authorities and governments have talked about the need to consider new policies on acquisitions by the digital giants as part of how they get a better handle on those giants. This is going to be a great case study in how that plays out. And because this does also represent a giant investing in an acquisition to take on another one of the giants, and the fact that this is an upstart small business that grew up into the biggest player in wearables, an opportunity for that innovative business to cash out to a degree and its investors to cash out, I think is going to be seen as a positive and is going to be seen as a defense for the acquisition, because at the end of the day, as much as there are concerns with the giants being too big, there's also interest in making sure that there's appropriate incentives for innovators. So, and then you have the China card in the background where, to be honest, some of the biggest players in this space are very low-cost competitors coming out of China. The fact that Google will put money into meaningful competition, I think will be seen as a positive as well. So we're going to see. I suspect there are going to be meaningful discussions and all kinds of ideas on limitations for how Google can use the user data and what kind of limitations will be applied on that. But this is going to be a very interesting topic, probably for the next year at least, as this acquisition goes through what promises to be meaningful government review. And it will be a great test of what it really means to potentially have a new kind of acquisition policy when it comes to the digital giants. So with that, this is Brian Bieron with PlatformEconomyInsights.com. I hope you find the topic as interesting as I do, and I'm sure there will be more and more to come on this acquisition as it moves forward.